Welcome to Lunch with the Lord. I'm Pastor Mark. We are in Esther chapter 1. We're going to be starting verse 10 this lesson. But before we begin, Jeremiah 15:16, thy words were found, and I did eat them. And thy word was unto me the joy and the rejoicing of my heart. Now, Vashti in verse 9, she's introduced. She's the queen. She makes a feast for the women that were invited to come from all these 127 provinces. And it's in the royal house which belonged to King Ahasuerus. All right. So Vashti is having her own feast probably with the women. And of course, the king and the men are having a feast of their own too. And now we enter into verse 10. Now, verses 10 through 12 deal with Vashti's refusal. Vashti's refusal. Now, verse 10 says, on the seventh day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, all right, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, and Abagtha, Zathar, and Carcass, the 7 chamberlains that served in the presence of Ahasuerus the king. Now, so it says here, it was on the 7th day, the final day of the feast that the king was had for the people that he invited. The number 7 in the Bible is the number of completion. You have God created the heavens and earth in the 7th day, and there are other times in the Bible where the number 7 refers to completion. And it's a number of finishing. And this day, the 7th day of the feast, would mark the end of Vashti's reign as queen. Now, it says, when the heart of the king was merry with wine. The king was drunk. All right, the king was drunk. I don't think the king was plastered, but for sure he was drunk. All right. Now, King Ahasuerus is about to make a decision that comes from his drunken mind. In almost all cases, no good thing comes from a drunken mind. The king's decision was a decision of vanity. It was a decision of pride and of lust. And it was made when his mind was in a drunken state. When a person is drunk, they do not lose the use of their senses, but they lose how to use their senses properly. Drunkenness takes away the ability to reason properly, and it also affects the speech to a degree that the drunken person sounds like they're a fool. Excess of alcohol will make any person ashamed. To truly live the Christian life in the midst of a world system that is bent on destroying your life and your testimony, it is imperative that we heed God's commands to be sober-minded, right? 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 13, it says, wherefore gird up the loins of your mind, be sober, and hope to the end for the grace that is brought unto you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. And chapter 4 and verse 7, it says, but the end of all things is at hand. Be ye therefore sober and watch unto prayer. All right. Chapter 5 and verse 8 says, be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, as a roaring liar, walks about. Roaring lion. Oh, he's a liar too. There's a roaring lion walks about, seeking whom he may devour. And then in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 8, it says, but let us who are of the day be sober, putting on the breastplate of faith and love, and for an helmet the hope of salvation. The Greek words for sober mean to be of a sound mind, right? It means to be free from any kind of intoxicant. Why? Because an intoxicant will weaken the mind, and it will affect all faculties of the mind. The mind's defense is being clear. The only hope of your mind defending itself is that it needs to be clear. It needs to be sober. It can't be affected by intoxicants. Once it is, then the defense of your mind is weakened tremendously. Listen, if you want to drink alcohol, that's between you and God. But my advice is to take the side of safety and stay away from it. Take the side of safety and stay away from alcohol. If you choose not to drink, you can be sure of serving God and bringing honor to Him. But if you play around with alcohol, you greatly risk destroying your walk with God and bringing shame on you and dishonor to God. Now, you can play around with alcohol if you want. My suggestion is stay away from it. Stay away from it totally. But if you want to drink, that's up to you. But again, you run the risk. You're running a risk. Yet, through all of this, God was using the drunkenness of the king to ultimately bring about his plan. You may say, Pastor Mark, what you're saying, did God make him drunk? No, God didn't make him drunk or anybody else drunk. If a person's drunk, they're drunk on their own. They're not. God doesn't make anybody drunk. Ahasuerus, he made himself drunk, but God used the drunkenness to bring about his plan. All right? Now, verse 11 says, so the king here now, he's feeling nice and happy with his drunken mind, and he tells his 7 chamberlains, and what does he tell them to do? Verse 11, to bring Vashti, the queen, before the king with the crown royal, to show the people and the princes her beauty, for she was fair to look on. Now, this was not a normal request of a king desiring to parade his wife in front of a bunch of other men. Some of them are drunk and some of them are not. This decision that the king made is a result of his alcohol. All right? It's a result of the alcohol. Now, some commentators think that, and I kind of lean this way too. You got a lot of men in this party. A lot of them are probably feeling good or drunk or feeling good. Maybe you got a couple of them that are plastered. And then it says in chapter 1, right, that, let me see if I can find out where it says here. And the drinking was according to the law, verse 8, none did compel, for so the king had appointed to all of his officers, right? What he's saying in verse 8 is that the drink offered wine to everybody, but nobody was forced to drink any more than they wanted to. So you had some that probably were drunk a little bit. I mean, they drank wine a little bit, but they weren't drunk. Some of them just probably stayed away. Probably few of them did. But especially when you got, men in there and the wine is free, there's going to be very few, maybe none, that wouldn't take a taste of wine. But then they got a number of them that are drunk, and a couple of them are probably plastered, right? But anyways, when you got a group of men in there and they're feeling pretty happy under the influence of alcohol, I kind of leaning towards some of the commentators. What they said is that they seemed to think that the men at the feast got discussing about women, right? And the beauty of women and how pretty their wives were, all right? And so here you got a bunch of drunken men, and there's from the 127 provinces, and they're probably got on the conversation, they got talking about women and the beauty of women and how beautiful their wives were, right? And the king, who's of course drunk now, not wanting to be outdone by any of his, nobles in the other provinces, decided that he wanted to show off his wife, right? So not only was he going to show her off, but he was going to have her put on the crown royal. Now, crown royal doesn't mean she brought in a jug of wine with her. No, this was the crown royal that she put on her head, of course. So the king, not wanting to be outdone by anybody in his province, says, well, I'll show these guys. I got the most beautiful wife in all the kingdom. And of course, who is going to disagree with me, right? Who's going to disagree with me? So he decides he's going to parade his wife with the crown royal on her head in front of all these guys so they can goo and god her, right? Now, it's very possible that this is what happened. Why? Because men will be men, right? Men will be men. And when you got a bunch of drunken men who are probably, they don't know God, unsaved, not living according to God, well, what do you expect? You expect men to be men. And when you got a bunch of drunk men together, we know what one subject they talk about? It's women. Not cars. They didn't have cars back then. but it's women. So I'm sure the subject of women came up in this group of drunk men. And so here's the king under the influence, and he decides he's going to parade his wife out in front of these drunk men, right? Now, because he's not going to be undone by anybody. Verse 12 says, but the queen Vashti, she refused to come at the king's commandment by his chamberlains. Therefore, the king was very wroth, and his anger burned in him. Now, the queen Vashti here, she refuses. Because of his own folly, the king's feast ended on a sour note. Queen Vashti's reputation has, for a long time, been seen as negative. Even today, there are people, Christians, who read the Bible and they read this portion of Scripture and they look down at Queen Vashti, right? Her reputation has been marred because she didn't obey the king. People think that she should have gone simply because the king commanded it. Therefore, she is in the wrong. Yet, this is not necessarily the full picture. Vashti appears on the scene in a few short verses. Then she disappears. And to most people, she disappears in disgrace. Yet it was not because of some sin that she committed or some foolish act that she did or of some bad judgment that she made. She is looked down upon simply because she refused the request of her king. And yet her refusal was a noble refusal. She risked her position as queen and all the glory that goes with being queen to take her stand and to require respect for being a woman. She would not allow even the king to diminish her rights as being a woman. And remember, she represents all women in all the 127 provinces. And she was making a statement for all women. When she refused, it was womanhood standing on its right to defend respect and not to be flaunted and disgraced before a bunch of drunken men. We must remember that the king's request would not have been made if he was sober. Women in those days were always kept separate from men except in their own house. And they definitely were not paraded in front of a bunch of men for vain purposes only. Vashti was left to guard her own modesty when her husband would not guard it for her. Putting the crown royal upon her head would not have given her any more respect for herself than what was already in her heart. Okay? Queen Vashti stood up for womanhood and putting the crown royal on and dressing and going in front of a bunch of drunk men. She was not going to do that. She was not going to disrespect herself. And if it meant losing her position as being queen, that's what she did. That's what she did. And I've taken, since studying this book, I've taken a different view on Vashti now as a woman who commanded respect for being a woman. Christian men and women, never sell out your position as a child of Almighty God because of some person's request. Remember, you are a king and you are a priest unto God. You are a member of a holy nation. You have a divine calling on your life. And God has set you apart as his own personal possession. Like I said, never sell out your position as a child of God because someone requests you to. There are kings who are poor in character, and there are poor people who are rich in character. Listen, let's be rich in the things of God and poor in the things of this world. Let's be rich towards the things of God and poor towards the things of this world. And then it says in the last part of verse 12, therefore the king was very wroth, and his anger burned within him. You know, His anger was fueled by the alcohol that was running through his veins. Therefore, his passion and his anger would overrule his common sense and reason. That's what happens. That's what happens with people who get under the influence. They make decisions based upon the influence of the alcohol, right? And they can't think right. And then they can't go back. They can't go back and redo it again. And here's the king. He's angry. And yet his anger is fueled by this alcohol. And he could not make a proper decision at that time. All right, until next lesson, we're going to start verse 13 next lesson. But until then, walk with the Lord. I know he walks with you.